Well, here we are again, 5 years after the launch of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and I already know, regardless of what I'm going to say, half of you are going to outright hate this game, and the other half are going to love it. That's where we're at with Ubisoft and Assassin's Creed. But as you know, if you've been following this channel for any stretch of time, we've spent hundreds of hours playing and creating videos on this franchise. We have a genuine interest in this series, but as always, we put every game we play through its paces, primarily focusing on the game's systems and gameplay, the things you guys have told us you care about the most. I am personally excited to talk about Assassin's Creed Shadows, a game set in a location fans of the series have been asking for since the beginning. But if you're expecting to hear about innovative gameplay, revolutionary systems, and a story worthy of record, well, you just don't know Ubisoft. So here's the headline. Assassin's Creed Shadows manages to build on the foundation from Valhalla, stripping away some of the things players didn't like and delivering a game I think many will enjoy. It is a familiar experience, which is both good and bad, and some of the big changes, like the introduction of a secondary, wildly different protagonist, add new wrinkles to an otherwise formulaic approach that feels expansive yet predictable. The main storyline feels more grounded, with more of an emphasis on real people undergoing real struggles and less on the magic and mysticism that sometimes dominated the previous games. Bloat is still a concern, but as always, what you put in is what you get out, and if you're someone that likes to 100% these types of games, yeah, it's gonna be a grind. That's not going to sit well with everyone, but as always, optional content is just that, optional. All in all, this is a safe step up from Valhalla, with little in the way of innovation, more tweaking around the edges to address some of the biggest concerns from the previous game. Now, I'll come back to that word formulaic in just a bit, because I think it's at the heart of Assassin's Creed's success and its failure. But first, let's ground ourselves in the game. Assassin's Creed Shadows takes the series to feudal Japan, during a time where warmongering daimyo fought for control no matter the cost. You play as both Nawe, a shinobi from the Iga clan, and Yasuke, a samurai turned peacekeeper after a critical point in the game's story. The game gives you near complete control over who you play at any point during your adventure, aside from a few character-specific quests, and I think that's important to say up front because I've seen a lot of angst around the dual protagonist approach. They are strikingly different characters from a story and gameplay perspective, with Nawe being your traditional assassin archetype that uses her agility to climb walls, drop down for aerial assassinations, and everything you'd expect from a mainline AC hero. On the other hand, Yasuke introduces something completely different, a combat-forward character that has very little stealth capabilities and instead relies on his strength and training as a samurai to overpower his enemies. Each of the main characters has access to a different set of weapons, as well as different mastery trees, which help them feel distinctly different, and who you choose to play throughout 99% of the game is entirely up to you. I'll tell you from my experience, I spent about 3/4 of my time on Nawe because I wanted a true Assassin's Creed experience, but that didn't stop me from busting out Yasuke a time or two just so I could carve a path through my enemies. Maybe I'm alone here, but I actually like the change, and I think it's a smart way to break up the archetypes, especially after there was so much discourse around Eivor and his supernatural abilities that made him practically godlike. The pivot away means you have two characters who both have clear strengths, but also clear weaknesses, and I think that helps keep the gameplay grounded for the majority of the experience. One of my big concerns going into the game was how Ubisoft would handle storytelling through the eyes of two protagonists, but it's very clear that Nawe is the lead, with Yasuke taking a slightly less important role. Their interactions aren't as heavy-handed as I thought they might be, and while they are allies, they hold tight to their values, which are forged by their pasts. It's actually a pretty cool, if not predictable, dynamic, with Nawe pushing back against oppression and corruption, and Yasuke being the loyal and steadfast samurai. In addition to that, how the team manages to use these characters to further the Assassins and Templar meta stories is also pretty interesting, but of course, no spoilers, but I will say that's certainly something worth checking out if the overarching Assassin's Creed story is something you've followed throughout the years. Besides the two protagonists, there are a lot of tweaks to familiar systems that I think play out in mostly a positive way. I don't think we're all going to agree on these, but from where I sit, one of the biggest, most positive changes was the removal of an eagle. Now I get it, this is an iconic element of Assassin's Creed, but I think we can also agree that it made the game too simple. In previous games, whenever you wanted to track enemy positions, mark points of interest, or get the layout of an area, you simply hit a button and all of that information would be at your fingertips. It was overpowered, not in the traditional sense, but because we didn't actually have to work for the information. Shadows changes by completely removing the eagle. Nawe still has the ability to sense enemies and mark them, but only as she's actively exploring the world. This feels far more organic, and while some might say eagle vision is still cheap, it feels better than instantly marking everything from the sky. The removal of the eagle also plays a huge factor when it comes to exploring a restricted section, something, as I'm sure you all know, you will do constantly throughout any Assassin's Creed game. Without the eagle, you're forced to find vantage points, mapping out the area in your head while also actively exploring it. This creates a dynamic we haven't seen in quite some time in Assassin's Creed, and I found that it actually helped elevate the stealth gameplay. The lack of instant information forces you to slow down and work through the process, which feels more akin to the Assassin's Creed games of old, while still maintaining some of the player comforts we've grown accustomed to, like the ability to still tag enemies once you see them. The introduction of Nawe's grapple hook is also the perfect element to layer on top of the stealth gameplay and fits like a glove with the theme of the game. Because of Japan's architecture, it's not always possible to run full tilt up a vertical wall, and that's where the grapple becomes essential. Nawe can use this to climb up walls or swing between locations. It's not as dynamic as some other games, but it's functional, unlocking new ways to explore and move around the world. I honestly underestimated how essential this item would be, and by the end of the game, I can comfortably say that it became just as important to my maneuverability as running and climbing. Stealth overall is going to feel familiar to anyone who's played any of the modern Assassin's Creed games, because it's essentially the same system from Valhalla. Things are gated a little differently, with Nawe's masteries opening up more advanced techniques like double assassinations, but the fundamentals are identical. What I actually think lends itself best to the stealth is the world itself. The Japan the team has created feels much denser than previous Assassin's Creed games, and I mean that for both structures and environmental assets. In Valhalla, when I was stealthing in, it often felt like there were only a few real options to get around an area, and that was largely due to the open layout of the world. It feels completely different in Shadows, especially in the cities where buildings are practically on top of each other, creating a network of walls, roofs, and environmental elements you can interact with in a sequence. At ground level, there's also a ton of vegetation that provides you additional stealth options. Shadows and the new prone system supposedly add even more depth to this stealth gameplay, but I never found that I really utilized either. Bottom line, the stealth is unsurprisingly similar from previous games, but the changes to the world design lend itself much better to the system overall. Simply put, the ceiling remains the same, but the floor has been raised. One thing that's different about Assassin's Creed Shadows is the way the game approaches questing and the overall story. The game features a sprawling objectives menu that continually expands as you meet key NPCs and discover more about assassination targets in each region. Your main objective is to find and assassinate the Shinbaku, a mysterious order of Japan's elite, pulling the strings and manipulating the population, but as you play through the game, entire side stories will reveal themselves. In one instance, you have to hunt down a group of corrupt daikon who are terrorizing locals in specific regions. Another side story has Yasuke track down and duel masters of different forms of samurai combat. These act as filler content, sure, but they also weave in additional storylines and provide experience, weapons, and armor that can help you bridge the gap between the main quests. One thing I did really enjoy was the way the game approached questing overall. Instead of a big quest log where you check everything off a list, you use that sprawling objectives menu to find quests associated with specific individuals or targets. Then you have to locate the quest objective by either utilizing your scouts to scan areas of the map, or find the target yourself using the Observe mode once you reach the general area. This helps make questing feel less go here, do that, and a bit more organic. There are some genuine moments of frustration where the clues don't really help you find the objective, or you end up searching an area for far longer than you should just to find your target, but it's still better than constantly being handheld through the entire game. Outside of the objective board, there are traditional side quests, and these play out exactly like they did in Valhalla. Talk to an NPC or witness something in the world and then complete the objective, which is often nearby. There's nothing too surprising here, but this is where the team gets a little loose with the storytelling, dialing up either the humor or the drama just a few notches more than you'd expect. Then there's the rest of the side activities, and once again, Ubisoft beats us over the head with a million little things to do. I wouldn't usually mind this because all of it is optional, but the difference with Shadows is that these side activities are directly tied to the tier of mastery skills you have access to, limiting what techniques you can use for both Nawe and Yasuke. In my opinion, this is incredibly limiting for a player because it forces me to complete dozens of, let's say it, pointless side activities so I can access better abilities for combat. Activities such as finding scrolls at a lost temple, praying at shrines, meditating with Nawe, running through forms with Yasuke. It is incredibly simple, not at all satisfying, and to directly tie that to progression doesn't feel great. To put it into perspective, I completed the main portion of the game only reaching rank 3 knowledge, and that's because I forced myself to stop for an entire night to grind up the knowledge points needed to expand my mastery, which doesn't feel good. Luckily, you don't really need to max out your mastery to be proficient in combat, but without all of the skills and techniques available in each tree, there's a simplicity to the fighting that becomes incredibly redundant. Unless you take the time to grind out and unlock every tier of mastery, you're going to go into a lot of combat situations with just 1 or 2 active abilities, and that certainly diminishes the action. Just like stealth, the combat feels more or less the same as it did in Valhalla, with just a few twists. For one, new flurry attacks telegraphed by blue glowing weapons require you to dodge or parry multiple successive blows before an enemy becomes vulnerable. Standard white attacks can be parried, and red ones of course have to be dodged. Outside of that, there are new posture attacks, which are slightly more powerful forms of your light and heavy attacks that allow you to guard break, which gives you the option for proactive offense, which I prefer over the wait and parry techniques, which is synonymous with this game. I should point out that Yasuke's gameplay is entirely based around combat and offense. I genuinely had fun slinging around his naginata and kanabo, which can absolutely devastate enemies, and while certainly not how I spent a majority of my playthrough, I did enjoy the simple fun Yasuke offered, running into areas and leaving a trail of bodies in my wake. Each of the main characters has access to a small assortment of weapons, with Nawe having access to the katana, kusarigama, and tanto, while Yasuke has a slightly larger arsenal featuring the long katana, naginata, kanabo, teppo, and bow. There is a metric ton of loot, including legendary gear, that you can obtain during almost every leg of the journey, and I was actually kind of surprised by that. Legendary gear features a legendary perk, but also has an engraving slot that you can use to make the weapon even better. Same goes for the armor and accessories. Unlike Valhalla, you only have 5 total gear slots, 2 weapons, head and body armor, and an accessory. I like the simplified equipment slots, but the sheer volume of gear you can obtain is actually a disservice to the game because you're so desensitized to the thrill of loot that rush of dopamine you would otherwise get whenever you loot something actually wanes away. That being said, some of the weapon animations, specifically the executions, are absolutely brutal, which I think a lot of players are going to enjoy. I mentioned some of the big changes to the game earlier in the headline, and there's one thing in particular I wanted to call out: the hideout. This is similar to the settlement in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, but also not at the same time. Ubisoft did a solid job with this system, giving players the chance to create a fully customizable base, mixing essential buildings that provide upgrades and progression with cosmetics that you can unlock and place around your hideout. Personally, I didn't spend a lot of time placing trees and creating cozy corners of my base, but I can see certain players loving this aspect of the game, especially because there, by my account, seem to be a lot of things players can find and unlock just by playing the game. This feels way better than the themed items that were present in Valhalla that could only be placed at very strategic parts of the settlement. Now you have almost complete control over the placement of entire buildings, rooms, and aesthetic items, and it feels good. You'll find these in the highest density in various wealth areas, locations guarded by enemies and filled with loot. Smaller resources can be picked up by Nawe and Yasuke, but larger pallets of resources can be tagged for your scouts to retrieve at the end of a season. Oh yeah, the game has dynamic seasons now, which completely changed the visual aesthetic of the world, which is pretty awesome. Those 3 resources are the key to upgrading your various hideout progression rooms and unlocking additional rooms and structures to be placed around your base. It's another example of something you really have to actively focus on if you want to take full advantage of everything the system has to offer. One thing I will say is a huge plus, at least in my eyes, is the lack of having to go back to your hideout every 5 minutes to advance the main quest. Occasionally, you'll need to go back there to use the forge and upgrade your gear, but for the most part, the game keeps you out in the world, not playing base manager, and that's a huge change from the previous game that saw almost every activity start and end at your settlement. So far, sounds like Assassin's Creed, right? The base formula of the game hasn't changed a whole lot, and while there's certainly tweaking around the edges, in my opinion, the game has taken a predictable and relatively safe step in the right direction. There is still a glaring issue with this game, and it's steeped in Ubisoft theory at this point, and it's the formulaic approach to game design. From the buildings and enemies to the loot and questing, everything feels systematic, and that's often why people refer to Ubisoft open world games as check-the-box experiences. Things that would be enjoyable in smaller doses become boondoggles because you have to do them a dozen plus times, and when you multiply that by however many systems that follow that same ideological design, there is a tediousness to Assassin's Creed Shadows that runs deeper than the game itself. Look, we all know this is Ubisoft's last bastion of hope for the company, and there's already rumors about the team selling off Assassin's Creed to a company like Tencent, which is saying a whole lot. That being said, the setting has been long desired by fans, and the gameplay is familiar, and in some cases, it is better. That's a formula for Assassin's Creed success, but it doesn't take away from the fact that there are elements of the game Ubisoft continues to recycle without ever taking any risks. That's what's missing from Assassin's Creed Shadows: innovation. Having a second protagonist doesn't accomplish that. While I do enjoy Yasuke's gameplay, I want to see the company take some risks. Everything can be anticipated, and I mean everything from the story to the quest design to the loot you receive. It is high time for Ubisoft to take this series in a new direction, and I get it, that is terrifying for a publicly traded company, but quite honestly, I don't give a hoot about that, because as the players that continue to support these games, we should demand better. Let me be clear, I had a good time playing Assassin's Creed Shadows. It is a sound game with some engaging, albeit repetitive systems. I can tell you though, point blank, there will be creators trying to rage bait the game's demise, but as always, we don't care about that stuff, and instead choose to focus on the gameplay and the systems, the things that matter to you guys. The issues I'm talking about run deeper, and I hope the team addresses them at some point, especially with games like Assassin's Creed Codename Hex on the horizon, which, if you believe the marketing, is pushing the game in a completely new direction. Ubisoft, much like Activision, EA, and other massive AAA companies, needs to get back to what made them giants in the first place: innovation and new ideas. So there you have it, guys. My full thoughts on Assassin's Creed Shadows, after beating the game and exploring pretty much everything the game has to offer. If you have any questions about the game, I'll be monitoring the comments in the first few hours after posting the video, so drop us your thoughts and be sure to hit that thumbs up so we know you watched. My name is Kodiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching, and play on.